Have you ever found yourself just, wrestling with a really big question, maybe one that felt almost too fundamental to even put into words?
Mm.
Things like, why are we actually here? Or
Yeah.
what's the real meaning of all this? Not just about, like, a specific problem you're facing, but about the whole fabric of
Yeah.
reality, right? Your own existence, your place in this huge, sometimes confusing world.
Absolutely. We all carry those questions around, I think. Sometimes they're right there on the surface. Other times they're just humming away in the background.
Exactly, like this unspoken backdrop to everything we see and do. But how do you even begin to unpack something that big, that foundational?
Well, that's precisely what we're diving into today. This deep dive is all about that concept, that really profound concept of worldview.
Ah, worldview. Okay.
Yeah. We've pulled together a pretty rich stack of sources, philosophical insights, sociological theories, theological perspectives, you name it, to really try and unpack what a worldview truly is. Where did this powerful idea even come from? And maybe most importantly, why is understanding it so crucial for, navigating our world today, which feels more complex and diverse than ever?
It sounds like it gets right to the core of
It
things.
really does. It's about recognizing those deep, often hidden foundations of how we approach existence itself.
And I have to say, reading through this, it struck me this isn't just some, abstract academic thing. It's not just theory.
Not at all.
It's about your deep-seated assumptions, the ones guiding your decisions, your interactions, maybe even when you're not consciously thinking about them at all.
That's the key. They operate constantly.
So we're going to try and help you spot these elephants, you could say, in
Yeah.
your own mental room. And maybe, just as importantly, help you recognize them in the mental rooms of other people, too.
Exactly. It's a journey really into the bedrock of belief. Where does our thinking actually start? Hashtag tag one. What is a worldview? The elephant all the way down.
Okay, so to kick us off, there's this really great story, one I've kind of adapted over the years, but it illustrates the core idea perfectly. Imagine this curious little boy, right? He's just learned the Earth is a big globe floating in space,
Uh-huh.
and he goes to his father, totally perplexed,
Yeah.
and asks, Dad, what holds up the world? Why doesn't it just fall?
The ultimate kid question.
Right. And his father, thinking fast, trying to keep it simple, just says, oh, it's a camel, son. A camel holds up the world.
A camel, okay.
The boy thinks, okay, a camel. Makes a weird kind of sense for a kid.
Yeah.
But his mind keeps working. Next day he's back. Dad, if a camel holds up the world, what holds up the camel?
Huh. Logical next step.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Father pauses, maybe thinks a bit harder this time, and replies, well, that's easy. It's a gigantic kangaroo.
A kangaroo now. Love
Yeah.
it.
So the boy processes that. But soon enough, he's back. And what holds up the kangaroo, Dad? The father, maybe getting a little exasperated, declares, it's a massive elephant, son. A huge elephant.
Okay, we're getting somewhere bigger now.
The boy's eyes widen, right? He's taking this in. But then, with that relentless kid logic, he says, come on, Dad. What holds up the elephant?
The final question.
And the father, in what one of our sources calls a fit of genius deriving from necessity, just throws his hands up and says, it's elephant all the way down.
Elephant all the way down. It's a fantastic image.
Yeah.
And that adapted story, charming as it is, it just nails two absolutely central characteristics of any worldview. First, what you could call its presuppositional character.
Presuppositional, okay.
Yeah. When the father gets pushed to elephant all the way down, he's hit bedrock. He's reached a fundamental, non-negotiable commitment. These are the points where, our spade is turned, like Wittgenstein said. We can't explain why anymore.
Because that's just what holds everything else up for you.
Exactly. They're the deeply held beliefs we simply accept as true, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly, so that everything else can make sense. We commit to them, even if we can't strictly prove them with external evidence alone. They are presupposed.
Got it. And the second characteristic.
The second is that the father is forced, maybe reluctantly, to articulate his understanding of prime reality. Elephant all the way down is his way of naming the ultimate foundation.
The thing that doesn't need holding up.
Precisely. What holds everything else in being but doesn't need anything to hold it up? It's the first holder. This points right to the most fundamental question a worldview tries to answer, whether you realize it or not. What is the really real? What's the ultimate nature of existence?
So, okay, if that father had been maybe a bit more philosophical from the get-go, he basically had two main paths he could have taken to answer that ultimate why, right?
Broadly speaking, yes, especially in Western thought.
On one hand, there's the naturalist path. He could have said, well, son, gravity holds the world up.
The scientific explanation.
But if the boy kept pushing,
But what makes gravity be? What's the source of all matter and energy?
The naturalist father eventually hits a wall where he has to say that's just the way it is. Or maybe it's matter and energy all the way down.
Right. The universe, in this view, is just there. It's the fundamental brute fact. It doesn't need an external cause or explanation for its existence or its inherent laws.
Hmm.
Nature is ultimate.
Okay. And the other path.
The other main path is the theist route. He could say, God made it that way, son, and it's God all the way down.
God all the way down.
This answer points to something different. A self-explanatory, maybe perfect, necessary being. A God who, by definition, just is, and therefore doesn't need holding up.
So these two, naturalism and theism, they represent really fundamental forks in the road for how we think about ultimate reality.
Absolutely. They're two foundational principles that have shaped so much of Western and Middle Eastern thought for thousands of years. Is nature ultimate, or is a divine being ultimate? And really, at the base of all our thinking about God, ourselves, the world, you usually find one of these orientations, or maybe some variation of them. It's foundational.
And it's not just that one big question about reality. A worldview, even if you haven't sat down and mapped it out, it kind of provides answers, or at least assumptions, for a whole bunch of really deep questions.
That's right. Our sources lay out a set of these fundamental questions that any worldview implicitly or explicitly addresses. Thinking about them helps us see our own underlying assumptions.
Okay, let's walk through them. What are these key questions?
All right, number one, we've touched on it. What is prime reality, the really real? Is it God, multiple gods, or just the material cosmos itself, a closed system?
Okay, the ultimate foundation.
Number two, what is the nature of external reality, the world around us? Is it something created, dependent, or is it autonomous, just existing on its own? Is it orderly or fundamentally chaotic, purely matter, or is there spirit involved too? And how do we relate to it? Is it objective, out there independent of us, or is it more subjective?
Lots to unpack just in that one.
Definitely. Number three, what is a human being? Are we just complex biological machines? Are we like sleeping gods with hidden potential? Are we made in the image of God with inherent purpose? Or maybe just naked apes, as Desmond Morris put it, products of chance evolution?
How we see ourselves.
That's crucial. Number four, what happens to persons at death? Is it just extinction, game over? Or is there transformation, maybe reincarnation or some kind of afterlife, a shadowy existence perhaps?
The big question about the end.
Number five, shifts gears a bit. Why is it possible to know anything at all? How does knowledge even work? Is it because we're made in the image of a rational God who built intelligibility into the universe? Or did consciousness and reason just emerge randomly through evolution with no ultimate guarantee our thoughts match reality?
Epistemology. How we know.
Exactly. Number six, how do we know what is right and wrong? Where does morality come from? Is it divinely revealed, just a social construct based on maximizing happiness? What's the grounding for ethics?
Our moral compass.
And finally, number seven, what is the meaning of human history? Is there a point to it all, a direction, a grand story unfolding, or is it, as some say, just one damn thing after another, ultimately meaningless?
Purpose in time.
Wow.
Those are huge questions.
They really are. And they might seem overwhelming, maybe even unanswerable in a final, definitive way. But here's the crucial insight from our sources. Whether we realize it or not, we cannot avoid assuming answers to them.
Just by living.
Just by living. Every choice, every action, every belief we hold implicitly leans on some underlying answer to these questions. We adopt a stance, even if it's completely unexamined.
So even trying not to have a worldview is kind of a worldview.
Exactly. Claiming total skepticism or neutrality is itself a stance, a worldview, and pushed to its extreme, it can lead towards nihilism, the belief that there's no ultimate meaning or value. So as one source puts it quite powerfully, we are caught.
No escaping it.
No escaping it. As long as we live by some worldview. The only choice is whether it's an examined one or an unexamined one.
Okay, so we have this idea of worldview as foundational. But the term itself, worldview, it has its own story, right? A history.
It does, yeah. It's fascinating, actually. The term is basically a translation of the German Weltanschauung.
Weltanschauung. Heard that one.
Right. It first popped up almost casually with Immanuel Kant, the big Enlightenment philosopher back in the late 18th century. But it really took off in the movements that followed him. German idealism, Romanticism. They started using it to talk about that fundamental set of beliefs that sort of underpins everything we think and do.
So it started in philosophy.
Deeply rooted there. But the figure who really brought worldview into sharp focus, who made it a central concept, was Wilhelm Dilthey. He was writing in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Okay, Dilthey. What was his key contribution?
Dilthey's really important insight was that a worldview isn't just a dry set of intellectual propositions, it's deeply personal. It arises, he said, directly from life itself.
From lived experience.
Exactly. Shaped by your individual character, your temperament, how you encounter the world. And it's through this personal lens that we grapple with what he called life's inescapable lived realities. Things like knowing we're going to die, or the fleeting nature of things.
So it starts personal and experiential.
Yes. He saw it evolving. Maybe it starts as a kind of simple cosmic picture, but it develops into a more sophisticated sense of who you are, what reality is like, what your values are. And ultimately, it culminates in what he called a comprehensive plan of life, a highest good.
So a whole life system almost.
Sort of. And crucially, Delphi was working after Kant, so he emphasized that what we perceive isn't just objective reality hitting our eyeballs. It's heavily dependent on our minds. We understand the world through the inherent structures of our own thinking.
So our worldview shapes what we even see.
In a sense, yes. For Dilthey, the worldview is that shaping structure of our autonomous selves. We see what our mental frameworks allow us to see. And because human experience is so varied, different climates, cultures, histories, he naturally recognized that there would be many different worldviews, a multiplicity of them.
Okay, so Dilthey grounds it in lived experience and the structure of our minds. But what happens if the assumed background, like belief in God, starts to fade?
Well, that brings us right to Friedrich Nietzsche. He comes along a bit later in the 19th century looking at European culture and seeing this decline in traditional belief.
The whole death of God idea.
Exactly. Which wasn't him saying God literally died, of course. It was his observation that the idea of God was losing its power to shape how people thought and lived.
It wasn't the functional center anymore.
Right. And Nietzsche's radical takeaway from this was profound. If there's no ultimate objective God providing a foundation, then there's no ultimate objective truth or meaning or purpose either.
That's a huge leap.
Huge. Humanity was left adrift, he thought. No fixed stars to navigate by, no external standards for truth or beauty or goodness. His proposed response, the Übermensch.
The Superman.
The Superman or Overman. This figure who, through sheer strength of will, creates his own values and imposes them on a world that has no inherent meaning itself.
Wow. So create your own meaning from scratch.
Pretty much. And this led Nietzsche to what's called complete perspectivism. His idea was that every worldview is fundamentally just a product of its specific time, its place, its culture.
So no worldview is objectively true.
For Nietzsche, no. He thought that for the people inside a worldview, it provides perfectly compelling standards. It tells them what's true, good, beautiful. But, and this is the kicker, he saw these worldviews as mere reifications.
Reifications.
Meaning they are basically subjective human creations that we mistakenly treat as if they were objective external truths. We solidify them, make them into things. For Nietzsche, what we call truth is really just an established convention, a habit of language, often serving hidden power dynamics.
So truth is just what we agree to call truth serving someone's interests.
In his view, yes, very radical.
Okay, that's a heavy perspective. What about Wittgenstein? He's mentioned here too, shifting towards language.
Right. Ludwig Wittgenstein, a hugely influential 20th century philosopher, took things in a slightly different, though related, direction. He really shifted the focus away from trying to grasp objective reality directly and onto the role of language.
How so?
He talked about worldviews being like world pictures that are so fundamental they're effectively doubt-proof. You can't really stand outside them to question them because they form the very basis of your questioning.
Like the air you breathe, almost.
Kind of. He used metaphors like the axis our thoughts revolve around, or the riverbed that channels our thinking, or the scaffolding that supports our actions. For Wittgenstein, these aren't just logical arguments you weigh, they're deep webs of belief that literally organize reality for us.
Organize it.
Yeah. His key insight, very simplified, was something like, all you can really say about your outlook is that this is how we operate, this is what makes sense to us, this is what we do.
He was famously skeptical about whether we could have knowledge of reality apart from language.
So the worldview is more about how we use language. It becomes primarily a hermeneutic, a way of interpreting and using language. In this view, language doesn't just describe reality, it actively constructs it. We see what our language game allows us to see.
Language constructs reality.
Yeah.
That's another big idea.
It is. And then you have Michel Foucault, mid-20th century, who built on this trajectory. He used terms like episteme.
Episteme.
Yeah, basically meaning the underlying knowledge structure of a particular historical era. He described it as an inescapable set of rules and regulations, a way of reasoning, a pattern of thinking that generate and govern all patterns of knowing. Very similar to worldview in function.
Okay, so another way of talking about these deep structures.
Right. But Foucault added a critical and very influential twist. He argued that all language, all knowledge claims are inherently tied up with power.
Knowledge is power, literally.
Or at least claims to knowledge are bids for power. From Foucault's perspective, worldviews aren't really about being objectively true or false in some universal sense. Their truth is more about their effectiveness in securing power for individuals or groups.
So the worldview that wins is the one that gains the most power.
That's the implication. Which, of course, leads to a kind of self-referential problem. If Foucault's own claims about language and power are also just a power play, then why should we accept his worldview? It's an inherent tension in that kind of analysis.
Right, it kind of undermines itself if you take it all away. Okay, so that's a rough sketch of how the concept developed in more secular or critical philosophy, questioning objective truth, focusing on perspective, language, power.
A very rough sketch, yes. But it shows a certain trajectory.
But you mentioned there was a parallel track in Christian thought. They were using the idea too, but differently.
Absolutely. At the same time these other thinkers were developing their ideas, there was a really rich engagement with the concept of worldview within Christian circles, but often starting from very different assumptions.
Like who?
Well, an early important figure was James Orr, a Scottish theologian writing in the early 20th century.
Okay, James Orr. What was his take?
Orr defined worldview as the widest view which the mind can take of things in an effort to grasp them together as a whole from the standpoint of some particular philosophy or theology.
Okay, grasping things as a whole.
Yeah. But notice the difference. Unlike the German idealists, who sometimes emphasized the mind creating reality, or, coming from his Christian perspective, believed firmly in a coherent, unified universe out there to be grasped. He talked about one set of laws, one order reigning.
So reality is objective and ordered.
That was his starting point. He saw worldviews as rooted deep in the constitution of human nature, involving both intellect and action, but his focus was definitely on the objective reality governed by God, not primarily on the subjective categories we use to perceive it. His framework was explicitly theological God, human beings, sin, redemption.
So more focus on the what is rather than just how we see.
Exactly. And building on Orr's kind of approach was Abraham Kuyper, a really influential Dutch theologian and politician, a contemporary of Orr.
Kuyper, right. Big name in some circles.
Huge. He famously presented Calvinism not just as a set of doctrines, but as an all-embracing life system, a complete worldview.
A life system. That sounds comprehensive.
It was meant to be. Kuyper argued that every worldview, whatever it is, has to address three fundamental relationships: our relationship to God, our relationship to other humans, and our relationship to the world.
God, man, world. The big three?
Right. And a key insight from Kuyper, one that's been incredibly influential, is that every worldview has a single conception or a fixed point of departure.
A fixed point. Like the elephant.
Kind of like the elephant, yeah. It's that central guiding principle from which everything else in that worldview logically flows or derives its meaning. That starting commitment shapes the whole system.
Okay, that makes sense. Having a core principle.
Then, taking Kuyper's ideas perhaps even further philosophically, was another Dutch thinker, Herman Dooyeweerd.
Dooyeweerd, okay, another philosopher.
Yes. And Dooyeweerd was maybe the most insistent that worldviews are fundamentally pre-theoretical commitments, not just theoretical systems we cook up in our heads.
Pre-theoretical meaning before conscious thought.
Or perhaps deeper than just conscious intellectual thought. He rooted these commitments in what he called the heart.
The heart, not just emotions.
No, not just emotions. More in the rich biblical sense, the unifying core of a human being, encompassing intellect, emotion, will, our spiritual center, the whole person.
Okay, the core of the person.
And Dooyeweerd identified two fundamental religious ground motives that shape this heart orientation. Essentially, man converted to God or man averted from God. This basic spiritual alignment, he argued, is decisive for all life and thought.
So our fundamental spiritual orientation shapes everything.
That was his core argument. It leads to this idea some call structure direction thinking. The idea is that the structures of reality, logic, biology, society are God-given and good. But a heart, averted from God, takes those good structures and twists them, directs them away from their intended purpose. So a naturalist might understand the laws of physics correctly, structure, but their overall interpretation and application of that knowledge is flawed because it's directed away from acknowledging the creator direction.
Interesting. So the same facts, different meaning or purpose depending on the heart's direction?
That's the idea. So if you look at evangelical thinkers today who talk about worldview, drawing on folks like Orr, Kuyper, and Dewey Weird, you see a kind of consensus emerging.
What are the key points of that consensus?
Generally, they see worldviews as 1. Rooted in pre-theoretical and presuppositional concepts that bedrock foundation for thought and action. 2. They're comprehensive, touching every area of life. 3. Ideally, they strive for logical coherence, though people aren't always perfectly consistent. 4. Crucially, they believe worldviews relate positively to reality, to the way things really are, ultimately grounded in God. And 5. They are fundamentally a matter of commitment, something you commit to that can't be absolutely proven by reason alone, though it's not necessarily irrational either.
Commitment, not just intellectual assent.
Exactly. And you also see influences from anthropology here, emphasizing that worldview isn't just ideas in the head, but deeply embedded in culture, in those invisible assumptions and values that shape behavior.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of the historical streams. But you mentioned a debate about the word worldview itself, the naming the cat problem.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing happening more recently. Despite this rich history, some contemporary scholars feel the term worldview itself is problematic.
Why? What's wrong with it?
Well, some feel it carries too much intellectualist baggage, like it focuses too much on conscious beliefs and systems of thought, and maybe not enough on practice, embodiment, or the social dimension. So they've either started avoiding the term, critiquing it, or inventing new terms altogether.
Like what? What are the alternatives?
One major example is the philosopher Charles Taylor. He often uses the term social imaginaries.
Social imaginaries. Okay, what does that capture?
Taylor uses it partly to get away from that potential ideas-only feel of worldview. He focuses more on what makes beliefs feel plausible or believable within a society, emphasizing the social dimension and the role of imagination, sometimes even setting aside traditional social theory. He definitely recognizes the pantheoretical aspect. You can see the influence of Dilthey and Kuyper there.
So it's about the shared background sense of things.
Kind of. But importantly, Taylor rejects pure idealism. Social imaginaries aren't just abstract ideas floating around. He sees them as embodied in material practices carried out by human beings in space and time, which are then intertwined with self-conceptions, modes of understanding. Ideas and practices are woven together.
Ideas are in the practices.
Exactly. And a key contribution from Taylor is his critique of what he calls the subtraction theory of history, the idea that modernity just happened because we shed old religious illusions. He argues, no, it's not just subtraction. It involved new inventions, new ways of imagining ourselves and society being actively constructed.
So we didn't just lose old beliefs, we built new ones.
Right. And you see other scholars, like the sociologists James Davis and Hunter, also picking up social imaginary to emphasize that sociological shared aspect, moving beyond purely individual intellectual frameworks.
Okay, so social imaginary emphasizes the shared practical background sense. What else?
Then you have James K. Smith, who's offered a really significant critique of what he calls worldview thinking.
A critique. What's his issue?
Smith's main point is that the traditional focus on worldview as primarily a set of conscious beliefs is inadequate because, frankly, people can have a very articulate, intellectually coherent worldview on paper, yet their actual lives, their behaviors, their desires might run completely counter to it.
The classic hypocrisy problem, basically.
In a sense, yes. He argues that we often overemphasize the idea that beliefs dictate actions. He flips it, suggesting that our practices often shape our beliefs and desires more powerfully than we realize.
Practices shape beliefs. How does that work?
This is where his idea of cultural liturgies comes in. His central argument is that we are constantly engaging in routines, habits, practices, many of them seemingly secular, like shopping at the mall or scrolling through social media, or even attending a sporting event that function like liturgies.
Liturgies, like
Yeah.
church services.
Sort of, but broader. He means they are formative practices that unconsciously embed certain ideas, values, and crucially desires into us. They train our hearts, acting as a kind of form of worship directed towards some ultimate vision of the good life, some God, whether we recognize it or not.
So going to the mall is shaping my heart towards consumerism,
Mm.
even if I say I'm not materialistic.
That's exactly the kind of thing he's getting at. His point is that our actions and habits might be forming our actual operative worldview much more than the beliefs we consciously profess. Andy Crouch is another voice emphasizing this embodied aspect, how our practices fuel our thoughts and behaviors, though sometimes the emphasis on practice can seem to downplay the role of ideas a bit too much for some critics.
So Smith and Crouch bring in the body, the habits, the desires. That adds another layer.
It really does. However, it's worth mentioning someone like N.T. Wright, the biblical scholar. He very much operates within that Krupperian tradition we talked about, using the term worldview extensively. But he offers really detailed, nuanced explanations that try to integrate these different dimensions.
Okay, how does Wright synthesize this?
Wright talks about worldviews relating to that deep, presuppositional, precognitive stage of a culture. But he says they characteristically do 5 things. They get expressed in story, they are enacted in praxis or practice, they are articulated in question answers, like our 7 basic questions, they are shaped by potent symbols, and they are framed by a sense of time and history.
Story, practice, questions, symbols, time. That sounds pretty comprehensive.
He argues these 5 elements interface and interact. They're not separate boxes. They're lived out by individuals within their social groups, embodied through things like religion, theology, art, imagination. Wright's big contribution has been applying this multi-layered framework very fruitfully to understand ancient texts like the New Testament, but also to analyze the underlying worldviews of modern scholars studying those texts.
So he uses worldview as an analytical tool for interpretation.
Very much so. So at the end of the day, this whole naming the cat discussion really highlights something important. How you define or describe worldview often reflects your own worldview, right? And your academic background, theology, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, they all ask slightly different questions and use terms in slightly different ways to get at this fundamental human reality.
So the label itself isn't magic, it's about understanding the underlying concept.
Exactly. It's complex, multi-layered, and the terms we use reflect our angle on it.
Okay, let's loop back to that little boy and his elephant. That first question he asked, what holds the world up?
Yeah.
When he asked that, he wasn't asking, how can we know what holds the world up? Or what does it mean that the world is held up? He was asking a straight-up question about reality, right? About what is.
Absolutely. He was demanding an ontological answer, ontology being the branch of philosophy dealing with the nature of being, existence, reality itself.
Not epistemology, how we know, or ethics, what we should do. He wanted to know what is.
Precisely. And if we look back at those 7 basic worldview questions we listed earlier,
Yeah.
the first 4, prime reality, external reality, human nature, death, they're fundamentally ontological. What is the nature of these things? Then the 5th, how is knowledge possible? That's epistemological. The 6th, right and wrong, is ethical. And the 7th meaning of history brings us back to ontology, seeking ultimate purpose and reality in time.
Okay, so there's an order there. Ontology seems pretty dominant at the start and end.
And the crucial point here, argued by many thinkers, is that the sequence matters profoundly. Which question do you answer first? What do you assume is your starting point? That order makes a massive difference to the shape of your entire worldview. It establishes what is truly first.
So what comes first? What are the options?
Well, let's take a traditional biblical worldview as an example.
Yeah.
Here, the ontological question, what is prime reality, is clearly answered first.
God is prime reality. The elephant is God.
Exactly. When God identifies himself to Moses in Exodus, that famous, I am who I am,
Yeah.
that's often interpreted as God declaring his own utter fundamentality. He just is. He's the source of all being, not dependent on anything else, not equated with anything created. For this worldview, God is what it means to be. Ontology first.
So being itself is the starting point.
Yes. And importantly, from this perspective, this God isn't just some abstract ground of being. For Christians, he is understood as personal, relational, acting in history, revealing himself. If this God is the prime reality, then the answers to all the other worldview questions flow from that.
How so?
Well, the cosmos is what he made it. Human beings are who he made them to be, defined by his creative acts, not just by our own self-perception, ethics. Grounded in his character and commands, human purpose. Determined by his plan. See how ontology sets the stage?
Yeah, everything derives from that first commitment about what's real.
And that includes knowledge, epistemology. From this viewpoint, knowledge isn't based on autonomous human reason figuring things out from scratch. It's predicated on the nature of what is a reality created by God. As the Christian thinker John Henry Newman put it, all knowledge forms one whole because its subject matter is one.
Because reality itself comes from one source.
Right. Human knowledge is possible in this view because God, describing the Gospel of John as the true light, which enlightens everyone, created us in his image. He built intelligibility into the creation and gave us the capacity, however flawed now, to understand it. So ontology, what God is and what he created, is the necessary foundation for epistemology, how we know.
So even the core message of Christianity, the gospel, starts with who is Jesus? Ontological question.
Exactly. Who is this person? What is his nature? And historically, you can argue that science itself emerged in the West, partly because of a worldview that saw the universe as orderly and intelligible, because it was made by a rational God, the divine logos, or reason. Ontology first.
Okay, so that's the ontology first approach, grounded in God as prime reality. What's the alternative?
Well, the major shift we see in the modern Western world, really kicking off in the 17th century, is a move towards epistemology first. And the key figure here is René Descartes.
Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
That's the one. You have to remember the context. Europe was torn apart by religious wars between different Christian groups. Skepticism was rampant. People were desperate for some kind of certainty, some unshakable foundation for knowledge that didn't rely on conflicting religious authorities.
A way out of the chaos.
Exactly. So Descartes embarks on this famous project of radical doubt. He decides to doubt absolutely everything he possibly can, the evidence of his senses, the existence of the external world, even whether God might be deceiving him.
Doubting everything until
Until he hits something he absolutely cannot doubt. And what he lands on is the fact that he is doubting, or, more broadly, that he is thinking. And if he's thinking, he must exist as a thinking thing. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
So the certainty starts with his own thinking self.
Precisely. That intuition of his own existence as a thinking thing becomes his Archimedean point, his unshakable foundation. From that self-certainty, he then tries to work his way back out. He argues for God's existence, saying his finite mind couldn't invent the idea of infinite perfection unless an infinite being placed it there. And then, based on God's goodness, arguing God wouldn't deceive him, he reestablishes the reliability of his senses and the existence of the external world.
So God world. The opposite order from the theistic view.
Completely flips it. And the massive implication was the apparent autonomy of human reason. Truth wasn't primarily received from revelation or grounded in God's being anymore. It was derived from and guaranteed by the certainty of the individual human mind. My reason becomes the starting point.
It sounds like the birth of the Enlightenment, confidence in reason.
It was a huge catalyst for it, absolutely, placing the thinking self at the foundation.
But did Descartes' project hold up? Were there criticisms?
Oh, big time, almost immediately. Philosophers pointed out that his arguments to get from the cogito back to God seemed weak or even circular. He seemed to rely on principles, like the idea that the cause must be adequate to the effect, that he hadn't actually subjected to his own initial radical doubt.
So he kind of smuggled some assumptions back in.
That was the critique. And later, thinkers like Nietzsche, and especially postmodernists, went even further and attacked the very I of the I think. Is there really a stable, unified I doing the thinking? Or is the I itself just a product of thought, maybe even a grammatical illusion?
The I might just be a construct.
That's the challenge. Richard Rorty, a later philosopher, argued that language sort of just happens, and the human self is created by the use of a vocabulary. There's no essential self or ego, little bit as he put it, underneath the language. Knowledge gets reduced to language games, and the solid Cartesian I dissolves.
So if epistemology comes first, and the knowing self isn't even stable, where does that leave you?
It can lead, and arguably has led, towards deep skepticism or relativism, where objective truth seems impossible to ground. If the foundation is just the shifting self or language, everything built on it seems shaky.
Okay, so we have ontology first, like in theism, and epistemology first, like Descartes. Are there other options for what comes first?
Well, some perspectives prioritize other things. Postmodern thought often leans towards hermeneutics first.
Hermeneutics, meaning interpretation.
Yeah, meaning or interpretation as the primary starting point. In this view, a worldview is seen mainly as a semiotic system of narrative signs. It's all about the symbols, stories, and language we use to interpret the world.
So meaning is the ultimate reality.
If you push it all the way, yeah. Ontology, what is kind of collapses into hermeneutics, how we interpret, it risks becoming language all the way down.
What's a pushback on that?
The common sense pushback is pretty straightforward. Doesn't something have to exist before it can have meaning or be interpreted? A worldview isn't usually thought of as being created by signs, rather, it's expressed through them. Fundamental categories like being or existence seem necessary before interpretation can even begin. They seem to carry truth value that isn't purely linguistic.
Like that story you mentioned about the rabbi and the land.
Exactly. He insisted it wasn't just a concept or a sign on a map, it was material stuff, something real ontologically prior to its interpretation.
Okay. Any other first things?
One other approach, maybe less common in mainstream Western philosophy, but very significant elsewhere, especially in the East, is worship first.
Worship first. How does that work?
In Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, there's a strong emphasis on the liturgical life. The saying goes, worship comes first, doctrine and discipline second. Doctrine isn't just abstract propositions. It's understood and experienced primarily within the context of corporate worship, of encountering the divine. You see earthly things in light of heavenly realities through the liturgy.
So the experience of worship shapes the understanding.
Profoundly. And you see variations of this in non-theistic or pantheistic Eastern traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism. Practices like meditation and ritual aren't just supplementary, they're often seen as the primary means of accessing the really real, whether that's conceived as union with the impersonal one, or realizing the ultimate nature of reality as empty of inherent self, not self.
So the practice links to the insight.
That's often the emphasis. Which raises interesting questions for us in the West, too, doesn't it? If someone engages in a practice like yoga, detached from its Hindu roots, does the practice itself subtly steer them towards a more impersonal view of transcendence? Or maybe away from the idea that reality is ultimately rational or personal? Does the practice shape the worldview, even unintendedly?
That's a really interesting question about embodiment again.
It is. But circling back to the main point about order, the core argument from many worldview thinkers, especially those in the theistic tradition, remains that ontology must logically come first. Starting with epistemology, with the fragile structure of the human ego, or autonomous human reason, is seen as building on shaky ground, potentially leading to skepticism or relativism.
Whereas starting with God, with being itself.
Claims to provide a solid, objective foundation that avoids those pitfalls. For them, what is determines what we can know and how we should live. That order, ontology first, is seen as crucial for a stable and coherent worldview.
Okay, so we've talked about the core questions and the importance of what comes first, ontology or epistemology. But when we talk about a worldview, it feels like it operates on different levels, right? It's not all conscious philosophical argument.
Absolutely not. That's a crucial point. Worldviews have a kind of texture, different layers. They aren't first theoretical constructs we consciously build. They're much deeper.
So what are these layers? Where does it start?
It starts at the level of the pre-theoretical. Think of this as the absolute bedrock of your mental wiring. These are notions so fundamental that you have to use them just to think at all. They're not what you think about, they're what you think with.
Like the absolute basics.
The absolute basics. Things like Aristotle's categories, substance, not something is a thing, quality, quantity, relation, place, time. It's almost impossible to imagine thought without these. Or think about cultural anthropologists who identify universal categories like self-other, relationship, classification, causality, space-time.
Things we just assume to make any sense of anything.
Exactly. Meaning itself, the idea of oughtness, that things should be a certain way, identity, that a thing is itself, contradiction, that something can't be true and false at the same time in the same way. These are seen as pre-theoretical. Even the boy asking what holds up the world was already using pre-theoretical concepts: self, other, existence, place, time. They're the assumed background context.
Okay, so that's the deepest, almost unconscious layer. What's next?
Next up, you have the presuppositional level. These are the big foundational beliefs or commitments we hold profoundly. We might have reasons for them, we might argue for them, but ultimately they can't be strictly proven by logical deduction from some more basic, universally accepted truth. They are commitments.
The things we take on faith, in a broad sense.
Yeah.
The elephant all the way down.
Exactly like the elephant. We commit to them, we live by them, maybe because, as one source suggests, we feel we need it in order to give our life enough meaning to keep going.
Can you give an example?
The existence and nature of God is a classic example. As we touched on, someone like Freud would argue the idea of God is an illusion, a presupposition arising from psychological need or social conditioning.
A human invention we presuppose is real.
Right. But contrast that with someone like Alvin Plantinga, the Christian philosopher. He talks about a sensus divinitatis, an innate sense of divinity. He argues humans have a natural disposition to form beliefs about God, triggered by experiences like seeing a starry sky or feeling guilt. For Plantinga, believing God isn't necessarily the conclusion of an argument. It can be properly basic, an intuitive grasp, a fundamental presupposition grounded in how we're made.
So different views on why we presuppose God, but agreement that it is a presupposition for many.
Precisely. And while the basic idea of being might be pre-theoretical, the specific character of God, say, as infinite, personal, triune, good creator, that's a complex presupposition held within a specific worldview like Christianity. It's a foundational commitment.
Okay, so pre-theoretical foundations, then presuppositional commitments. What's the next layer?
Then you get to the theoretical level. This is where the conscious mind gets to work, articulating, deriving, comparing, and considering ideas and beliefs. This is where we develop theologies, philosophies, ethical systems, scientific theories. While worldviews are rooted in the pre-theoretical and presuppositional, they absolutely result in these conscious theoretical frameworks. We try to make sense of and explain our deeper commitments.
So the intellectual working out of the deeper stuff.
Exactly. But it's crucial to remember, as we discuss with Dilthey and others, that worldviews aren't just these intellectual layers. They are completely, inextricably tied to lived experience and behavior.
Right, they're not just in the head.
Not at all. Dilthey said they emerge from the standing in the middle of life, giving us stability. Kuyper called his worldview a life system. Walsh and Middleton said worldviews are ways of seeing, best understood by watching how they walk. If your actions consistently contradict your stated beliefs,
Then your actions might reveal your real worldview.
they argue that inconsistent behavior belies what we say is our worldview. Our true worldview is incarnated in how we live.
Which brings us back to James K. Smith and his cultural liturgies, right?
Hmm?
The idea that our practices are shaping us.
Exactly. Smith forcefully argues that it's not just ideas shaping actions. Often, our routine practices, our liturgies, are unconsciously embedding ideas, values, and desires into us. They are shaping our loves, forming us in a certain way, worshiping a certain vision of the good life, even if we don't articulate it that way.
So knowing and doing are tangled together.
It's a symbiotic relationship, absolutely. Not a simple one-way street from thought to action or vice versa. A worldview is truly a way of life.
And part of that lived reality often involves stories, doesn't it? You mentioned master stories or mitten narratives.
Yes, that's another crucial dimension. All worldviews seem to incorporate some kind of operative story, a master narrative or meta-narrative that helps make sense of time and meaning. These stories, whether from ancient myths, folklore, religious texts, literature, even scientific accounts, provide the orienting patterns for how a society understands the universe and its place within it.
Even worldviews that claim not to like stories.
Ironically, yes. The Enlightenment tried to dismiss stories as primitive, favoring pure reason, yet it operated with its own grand narrative of progress through reason. Naturalism, which underpins much modern science, relies heavily on the grand narrative of evolution, cosmic evolution, geological, biological, cultural, psychological evolution. It's a massive story explaining origins and development.
And postmodernism. It famously rejects meta-narratives, right?
It does. Postmodernism is characterized by its incredulity toward meta-narratives, its suspicion of any single, all-encompassing story claiming universal truth. But as critics point out, this rejection itself tends to function as an overarching story, a meta-narrative about the dangers and illusions of other meta-narratives.
A story about why stories are bad.
Kind of, yeah. And in contrast, the Christian worldview, for example, is explicitly both intellectual and narrative. It combines theoretical concepts, like God as creator, sovereign trinity, with a powerful foundational story, the story told in Scripture, and summarized in things like the Apostles' Creed: creation, fall, redemption through Christ's life, death, and resurrection, and the future hope of new creation or glorification.
So the story is central to the belief system.
Yeah, absolutely central. And thinkers like Middleton and Walsh, writing for a more postmodern audience, consciously retell that biblical meta-narrative. They frame it as a narrative of freedom that actually works against oppressive, totalizing power structures, emphasizing God's concern for the suffering and his ultimate goal for creation. Their simple framework questions, who am I, where am I, what's wrong, what's the remedy, are designed to express a compelling Christian worldview through narrative, offering both a vision of life and a vision for life that resonates today.
So the texture is rich. Pre-theoretical, presuppositional, theoretical, lived out in practice, and shaped by a master story. It's a lot more than just a list of beliefs.
Much, much more. It's the whole orientation of the person and the community in the world.
Okay, so worldviews aren't just individual things floating in space.
Mhm.
They exist within cultures, within communities. There's a public and private aspect, right?
Definitely. There's a constant interplay. Everyone has a private worldview, that often unconscious set of assumptions guiding your moment-by-moment perceptions and actions. You wake up in the morning, you instantly know you're in your bedroom, you know how to navigate your house, you don't consciously run through philosophical proofs for the existence of your bed each morning.
Right, it's just the assumed framework.
It's the framework through which you experience the world. But this private worldview is deeply shaped by the public worldviews of the communities and cultures you're part of.
How does that work?
Well, some aspects are shared because we're all human, those pre-theoretical categories we talked about. Then you have broader cultural assumptions that feel almost universal within a society, like, say, the general value placed on individual life in many Western cultures, or the assumption that our senses give us basically reliable information about the world.
Things most people in a culture just take for granted.
Exactly. And then you get more specific presuppositions shared within particular groups, religious communities, like the Christian belief that humans are made in God's image, national identities, even family traditions. As the group gets smaller, the shared assumptions often become more detailed, creating these nested layers of worldview.
So my personal worldview is interacting with all these public ones.
Constantly. Which leads us to a really useful sociological concept: plausibility structures.
Plausibility structure. Okay, what are they?
It's basically the term for that web of beliefs and assumptions that is so deeply embedded within a particular society or group that people just hold them unconsciously or find them completely self-evident. It's like the background common sense of a community.
The things that just seem obviously true to people in that group.
Right. This plausibility structure acts as a support system, or sometimes a barrier, for individual beliefs. Think about asking for directions. If you say, "I looked it up on Google Maps," that's plausible within our current structure. If you say, "I consulted the entrails of a chicken," or "I read it in a 2,000-year-old sacred text," that's generally not considered plausible for navigating traffic today by most people.
Okay, yeah. Context matters for what seems believable.
Hugely. Or think about the question, how does one get to heaven? Saying believe in Jesus is only plausible, perhaps even intelligible, within a broadly Christian or culturally Christianized plausibility structure. To someone outside that structure, it might sound nonsensical or arbitrary.
And this plays out in more formal settings too, right? Like academia.
Oh, absolutely. We touched on the Richard Dawkins example. His reported dismissal of Michael Behe's design science, simply because Behe believes in God, shows how a dominant plausibility structure, in this case, naturalism within much of the scientific academy, can function. Within that structure, appealing to a divine designer is considered inherently implausible, a non-starter for scientific explanation, so the argument might be dismissed without engaging its specific points.
The background assumptions filter what arguments even get heard.
Precisely, and this becomes really complicated in highly pluralistic societies, like the US is now. You have so many different communities with vastly different plausibility structures living side by side. Rastafarians, secular humanists, Orthodox Jews, Hindus, New Age spiritualists, traditional Catholics.
All rubbing shoulders, all with different fundamental assumptions.
Exactly. One source calls the overarching public plausibility structure in such societies a flimsy scaffold. It can lead to this strange situation sometimes called ciphered nihilism, where on the surface everyone is tolerant, but underneath there's no shared agreement on fundamental values or truth, leading to a kind of hidden relativism. Or you get a superficial tolerance that papers over deep, unresolved contradictions about reality.
Which brings us back to that question. Can we know objective truth in such a world?
And that depends entirely on your worldview's starting point, doesn't it? If you start with the theistic premise that God is the really real and created us in his image with the capacity for knowledge, then yes, objective knowledge is considered possible, even if our grasp of it is flawed or incomplete. Because ontology, the nature of God and his creation, grounds epistemology. If you start elsewhere, the path to objective knowledge becomes much more problematic.
Okay, so understanding these dynamics, private, public, plausibility structures, it seems like worldview becomes a really powerful tool for analysis.
Immensely powerful. It helps bring clarity to why people think and act the way they do in a world full of clashing ideas.
How can we use it? What kind of analysis?
Well, first and foremost, for self-analysis. Becoming conscious of your own worldview is a critical, ongoing task. What are my bedrock assumptions? Where did they come from? How have they changed? How do my actions align with or contradict my stated beliefs?
Looking at what my life tells me my worldview is, not just what I think it is.
Exactly. It requires real honesty and introspection. Sometimes this process can be triggered by encountering different worldviews or facing life crises, and it can be deeply transformative.
Like the story of Cixia Liu you mentioned.
Yes, that essay is a powerful example of this personal transformation through worldview encounter and analysis. She describes growing up in China with this blend of naturalism, communism, Taoism.
Right. Matter's primary, science is truth, duty to the future, leaders as gods.
Exactly. Her mother taught her the world is just matter, knowledge is power. Communism was the ideal society, rich together or poor together. It provided a kind of meaning, a happiness of the fish, she called it, a sense of harmony in a world without a personal God.
But then it started to unravel for her.
Yes, as China opened up, the communist dream, based on the idea of human perfectibility, began to seem unrealistic. She and her friends realized it wouldn't work because people aren't perfect. This created what she called a missing land, a profound intellectual and existential confusion. She literally broke out in sweat trying to make sense of it all.
A real crisis.
A deep one. But then, through a series of events, she encountered Christianity, specifically the Book of Romans in the New Testament. And for her, it was like discovering a different sky.
A different sky. Meaning,
It offered a completely different framework. She felt she found truth, love, purpose, a spiritual dimension she hadn't known, a relationship with a personal, infinite good God. Her whole life felt reoriented, more meaningful, less focused on material gain, finding purpose even in suffering. It's a vivid illustration of how a fundamental worldview shift isn't just intellectual, it's deeply personal, emotional, and life-changing.
wow. That's a powerful story of self-analysis leading to change. What about analyzing others?
Worldview analysis is crucial for understanding other individuals, too. It helps us grasp why people think and act the way they do, moving beyond simple agreement or disagreement.
Like with Václav Havel.
Exactly. Reading Havel, the Czech playwright and president, you see this deep sense of an order of being, something like an omniscient, omnipresent moral authority woven into reality, making us accountable. It sounds very theistic.
But he didn't like using the word God.
Right. He expressed a sense of shame or reluctance about using the word God directly in his public political writings, perhaps fearing it sounded too personal or projected too much. Analyzing his worldview reveals this nuance, a profound moral and spiritual sense, wrestling with ultimate responsibility, but perhaps stopping short of traditional theism in its explicit formulation. It helps you understand his specific stance.
Okay, so it reveals nuances. What about the Basha haiku example?
That's a great example of how worldview analysis unlocks meaning in art or literature from a different culture, the haiku. An ancient pond, a frog leaps in the sound of water.
Seems simple.
On the surface, yes, a nature scene. But if you understand Basha's Zen Buddhist worldview, it takes on deeper layers. Zen often emphasizes the timeless now, the present moment as the intersection of past and future. There's a focus on impermanence, change is all that is permanent, which can lead towards understanding ultimate reality as void or emptiness, not in a negative sense, but as the absence of fixed, independent thingishness.
So the haiku isn't just about a frog.
It's often interpreted as evoking that Zen experience. The sound of water isn't just vibrations, it's a trigger for experiencing that moment of nothingness, the interface between fleeting perception and ultimate reality, an intuitive grasp of the interconnected, impermanent flow of existence. It's a glimpse into a worldview where consciousness directly apprehends reality without needing a separate creator god.
So understanding the Zen worldview transforms the poem's meaning.
Completely. Now, someone with a Christian worldview might appreciate the artistry, the observation of creation, but they would interpret the ultimate reality behind the sound of water very differently, pointing to God as the creator. But the analysis helps you see what the poem is doing within its own framework. It opens a doorway into another way of seeing.
Okay, so self-analysis, analyzing others. What else?
We can apply it to cultural analysis. We can try to distill the major worldviews operating in a culture. Christian theism, deism, naturalism, nihilism, existentialism, various Eastern views, New Age thinking, postmodernism. Recognizing these broad patterns helps make sense of cultural trends and conflicts. Though we always have to remember that individual worldviews are often messier, more fluid, and change under pressure. What we say we believe about something might not perfectly match how we react in a crisis. Our lived worldview can be revealed under stress.
The difference between professed belief and functional belief.
Exactly. And finally, worldview analysis is critical for academic analysis. Every field of study, science, history, literature, sociology, operates on a set of foundational worldview assumptions.
Assumptions about reality and knowledge.
Yes, assumptions about the orderliness of the universe, needed for science, the capacity of the human mind to understand it, the nature of causality, whether reality is contingent or necessary. We saw how science historically grew out of a Christian worldview, assuming a rational creator, logos, guaranteeing an orderly cosmos.
But now often operates under naturalism.
Right, where the order is just assumed as a brute fact. It's just the way it is. Or think about religious studies. If the dominant worldview assumption is naturalistic, the field might become the study of belief in God as a historical or anthropological phenomenon, rather than engaging the ontological question of God's actual existence. Theology might become just history of ideas.
So the underlying worldview shapes the questions the discipline even asks.
Fundamentally, it shows that these foundational notions in any field are often assumptions, presuppositions, not necessarily proven facts within the field itself. They are the worldview lens through which the discipline operates.
So it seems like understanding worldview is inescapable if we want to make sense of anything, from ourselves to our culture to academic debates.
It really is. Pluralism puts pressure on us, maybe pushes some towards relativism, but most people hold their core beliefs, their elephants, pretty firmly. Understanding the concept of worldview doesn't solve all disagreements, but it helps us diagnose them. It helps us understand why seemingly intelligent people can look at the same world and come to such radically different conclusions. It makes the seemingly senseless clashes a bit more comprehensible.
It moves us from just clashing to potentially understanding the source of the clash.
Which is a huge step forward. #tag outro. So, wrapping this up, what we've seen is that worldview analysis really helps bring the big picture into focus, doesn't it? It gets to the heart of the matter, illuminating why we see things so differently, why we have these deep disagreements. It's just an unavoidable part of being human.
Yeah, and if we were to try and refine a definition based on everything we've discussed, it sounds like a worldview is something like a fundamental orientation of the heart, using heart in that rich biblical sense you mentioned, covering intellect, emotions, will, our spiritual core.
Right, the whole person.
And this orientation, it generates our answers, maybe implicit, maybe explicit, to those fundamental questions about reality, humanity, meaning, purpose. It gets lived out through a master story, shaping our actions, influencing everything we think and do, even down to our deepest desires and loves.
That captures it well. It's that core orientation, generating answers, lived in story and practice, affecting everything. It's who we are at the deepest level.
So when we face that ultimate question from the story, what holds up the world? Naming that elephant, whatever it is for us, that's our inescapable commitment.
It truly is. Whether we name it consciously or it just operates unconsciously, we all have an elephant. And for Christians, the answer they propose, the commitment they make, is clear and profound. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ is the elephant.
The ultimate foundation.
From their perspective, he alone is self-existent, worthy, and powerful enough to be the ultimate answer. The one who holds up not just our little world, but the entire staggering cosmos. He is the prime reality.
It's a powerful final thought.
Right.
So as you, our listener, go about your day, maybe take some time to think about your own worldview. It's your elephant.
Yeah.
And try to recognize the elephants holding up the worlds of others you interact with.
It's a journey of understanding. Not necessarily agreement, but understanding. And that can make a world of difference.